is just provide a bit of background as to what I see as the role that economics has played, leading us to where we are now in a world that has many, many challenges, huge challenges in front of us. What some of the problems with that sort of particular type of economics, what the problems are with that, and then touch on how we can maybe do economics and economic policy differently if we are, as the title of my presentation suggests, to change the world for the better. So starting off, so we're going to start with a quote, and I promise this isn't going to be one of these presentations with lots of quotes from old white guys, because there is a lot of that in economics, I can tell you. But I did want to start with one, and this is by John Maynard Keynes, who was one of the most famous economists of the 20th century. And he said, practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. And I think for the past 40 years or so, we all have kind of, whether we're aware or not, been to some extent a slave of this not yet defunct set of economic ideas. And these ideas have shaped the way that I think people think about the economy. It's certainly shaped the way that our politics operates, and it's certainly had a massive impact on government policy. And so I think it's still the case that although we are starting to see things to change and people challenging sort of orthodox economic ideas, our lives, our classrooms, and our politics are still very much gripped by a set of ideas and economic orthodoxies that I think are increasingly past their sell-by date. I'm not going to be able to cover everything here, and so I'm going to focus on some specific areas, and obviously we're going to go through this quite quickly, and so definitely keen, do make a note of anything that you want to ask about or raise or discuss more. I'm very happy to kind of go back and focus on that a bit more. The next thing I just wanted to emphasize, though, is that economic paradigms or economic systems aren't something that are set in stone or that last forever. Crudely, even in sort of Western political economy, particularly in the UK, we have experienced two quite big dramatic shifts in what you might call an economic paradigm or an economic sort of school system. And that was the two main ones, mainly from what you might call a sort of laissez-faire, a pre-World War I system, which sort of broke down with the Great Depression, the Wall Street crash, and that was followed by quite a dramatic departure from that after World War II, with the creation of the welfare state, in this country the NHS, and a period of what's sometimes referred to as Keynesian policy, named after John Maynard Keynes on the past slide, which was generally seen as quite a big role for the government in the economy. You had in this country nationalisation of quite a few industries and things like that, and this is often called the sort of post-war consensus era. And then that broke down in itself in the particularly 1970s, and that was followed by an embrace of a very different approach, embrace of a free market economic approach in the 1980s by Margaret Thatcher in this country and others elsewhere. And this sort of ushered in quite a new approach to managing the economy that we've kind of been living broadly with ever since in the 1980s. And that system's often referred to as neoliberalism. So the point with this slide is just to show that actually things can and do change, and I think need to change if we are going to address the key challenges of the 21st century. Okay, so this what I want to just do here is there are some sort of key touchstone points of what you might call modern sort of conventional economics, and these are the kind of assumptions that are rooted in the kind of economics that has been taught in most universities over the past 4 decades, and indeed the kind of assumptions that are very much still influence public policy and have done for a long time. And this basically sort of says that goods and services in the economy are most efficiently produced by profit maximizing private firms operating in a competitive market, and that really businesses and private enterprise are the real wealth creators that drive innovation and technological process. And actually, because the government and the state doesn't really know much, it doesn't have the knowledge or the expertise to actually allocate resources, it should really basically take a step back, and it really should only do things either to the private sector to either promote competition, to kind of create a fair level playing field, or in very certain circumstances to fix what are known as market failures. And these are things where only where the market is being kind of proven not to be able to do things very well should the government do things. And crucially as well, a key thing is that as long as there are free markets and competition, this idea that everyone will basically receive rewards in line with their true contribution. And this is a kind of key thing in mainstream economics, and neoclassical economics as it's called, which is the idea of who gets what and why. The answer to that is actually, if you have proper competition in markets, then everyone will get kind of what they deserve. And crucially, finally, which I come on to talk about more, the natural environment, such as that is mentioned, which often it's just completely ignored. When it is discussed, it's discussed as something known as an externality, which means it's external to the economy, and it's something that's separate to the economy, that's thought of as a sort of external, which as we'll come on to talk about is rather problematic. Now these bullet points here are kind of a crude overview, but broadly these are the sort of core underlying assumptions that have been taught in economics, that have then guided economic policy. And I'm sure we're all familiar with the kind of policies that this kind of insights has led to. It's privatizations. The UK has privatized more than almost any other country in the world. It's deregulation of industries, of sectors, the financial sector in particular, but lots of industries seeing regulation as red tape. It's liberalization. It's opening up, putting in market incentives and mechanisms into areas of the society where there previously was no market incentives. And so all these kinds of policies that we're very much used to happening over the past 3 or 4 decades are sort of underpinned intellectually by economics as a sort of a discipline, as it's been taught to students of economics in universities. Now, I think that today we're sort of reaping the consequences of this approach to managing the economy, and I've just sort of mentioned some on here. I'm not going to go into these in any details because I'm sure there are problems that we're all very, very familiar with. But basically, I think that the sort of the way of managing the economy, which, as I said, we've sort of had broadly since the 1980s, is rapidly losing legitimacy, I think, in the face of multiple crises. Skyrocketing inequality, we all know about that. Stagnant or falling living standards. For many people, I haven't seen increases in the living standards, or indeed I've seen decreases. A financial sector that's got completely out of control, that serves itself rather than society, that's caused, that's triggered huge financial crises, again, the consequences of which we're still living with. And the erosion of public services, either privatized or underfunded. Again, we're seeing with the COVID crisis the consequences of that, particularly in places like the UK and the US. It's no coincidence, I think, that the two countries which kind of embrace this approach of managing the economy the most have been the ones that have dealt with COVID-19 the worst. And of course, finally, escalating environmental breakdown and basically careering towards climate catastrophe at a rate of knots, and not seemingly unable to do anything about it, really. And so I think the need for a new economics, a new approach to managing the economy has never been more urgent. Before we go on to talk about alternatives, I just want to highlight a couple of kind of key points which I think are kind of useful in sort of rebutting some of the things you hear about the sort of conventional view of the economy. So I'll focus on a couple of concrete examples, and then we'll go on to talk about how we might do things differently and some of the key sort of foundations of that, in my view at least. So one of the things that, as I said, that the assumptions in economics as it's been taught is this idea that actually it's the private sector and the profit motive that's really responsible for delivering progress, and that's the kind of engine of technological progress, and that's the engine of human advancement. And throughout history there are countless examples of some of humanity's greatest achievements which actually haven't arisen from profit-oriented competition at all, but from collective action. Whether it's things like universal healthcare, never been achieved by the private sector, landing on the moon, or even, as I want to show here, this is just by my colleague Mariana Mazzucato, who founded the institute that I work at, which is even things like the iPhone, which most people see as being the kind of archetypal capital, free market success story. Most of the key components in the iPhone technologically were actually funded by the public sector in the first instance. So whether it's the touch screen, whether it's lithium batteries, whether it's the internet itself, whether it's all the different components, most of these things were actually done, the heavy lifting, if you like, was done by the public sector initially. And then the sort of private sector came to piggyback later on when things became profitable. And another example, just that's very pertinent, I just saw this today, is obviously the COVID vaccines as well. Pharmaceutical industry is another great example where, although dominated by big pharma companies and the profit motive, actually the heavy lifting, if you like, is more or less always done by public funding and the public sector, because the private sector sees it as too risky. And so you can see here with all the different vaccines that are under, most of them anyway, that are under works just now, most have been overwhelmingly led by the public sector, public funding. The other thing I just want to touch on briefly, just before we go on to solutions, is the question of sort of who gets what and why. And this story that been told in the economics profession, and you hear in politics as well, that actually sort of people get what they deserve, and as long as you have free markets and competition, it's kind of the distribution of wealth is kind of a fair outcome. Empirically, that it's just not the case, and there are a number of different examples here. But the one I think is quite good is in the UK. It's very pertinent. It's just the housing market, which by far the biggest way that wealth has been accumulated, hands down, in this country over the past 30 years, has just been by house prices going up. That's literally about 3/4 of all the wealth that's been accumulated has come through rising house prices. And obviously that has nothing to do with someone's work or effort. They've just owned something and the price has gone up. And I think this article here from the Daily Mash, I always quite like, says, "Man whose house has gone up in value thinks he's a brilliant businessman." But obviously this has, it's not just domestically that this is the case. It's also the case in terms of how this plays out internationally, in terms of the question of who gets what and why has a lot more to do with politics and power than it has to do with anything to do with your actual contribution or productivity. And in particular, there's a big difference between who often creates wealth in society and who creates value, and then who actually extracts it, who actually gets that, who actually benefits from that. And I think increasingly over the past 3 or 4 decades, we've seen a massive departure, on the one hand, between those who are creating value and those who are extracting it. And again, in the COVID crisis, I think we've seen this come through with the key workers. Classic example of this, whereas according to the market, key workers are often actually some of the lower paid people in society, have been earning not much more than minimum wage in many cases. But actually, when it came to the crunch, we realized we actually couldn't function without them, and we actually could function without other things, some of the highest paid roles in finance and things like that. We actually can get by with that. So there's this mismatch between the narrative that you hear in economics traditionally and actually the reality. And finally, I'm not going to dwell on this much at all, just in terms of the environmental question. I mean, this just shows, this is the IPCC projections in terms of the pathway of emissions that we need to follow globally if we are to stay within 1.5 degrees warming. And you can see historically the trajectory that we've been on and what needs to happen. It's so out of kilter with what's been happening that it's pretty clear that relying on anything like business as usual in order to get there is just not going to work. What we need is something that is dramatically different if we're going to avoid hurtling towards climate catastrophe. And so I think that's just a striking, there are obviously other elements to the environmental crisis apart from climate change, but I think that's one quite striking example. Okay, so moving on to how we might do things differently. I mean, one of the things I think it's important to highlight here is that we're often told, we often hear, again, in the discourse in politics, but also in economics, that the idea that we shouldn't intervene in markets. Markets are these sorts of spontaneous things that sort of act according, that have their own life and have their own energy, and that we shouldn't really dabble with that. We shouldn't really intervene in that unless we have a very good reason. I think it's important to stress that markets generally out there, they're not sort of spontaneous laws of nature. They've been created and sustained by often significant state intervention. And so things like, in order for businesses to trade, in order for markets to function, they're absolutely underpinned by property rights, laws, regulations, all of which is set up, enforced, designed by the state and by the government. And the kind of economic outcomes that we see in society and environmental outcomes is really an outcome really of how we design this institutional apparatus. And so when people talk about the invisible hand of the market, that's the phrase that economists sometimes use, meaning the invisible hand of the market kind of works its magic spontaneously. It's actually by a large degree a sort of feature of design. Sometimes you hear people say we already live in a planned economy, we just don't have control of the steering wheel, and that the outcomes that we see that are being supposedly driven by the market are actually being driven by specific policy designs that someone somewhere has put into place. And what that means is that there's nothing inevitable about that. We can redesign that architecture in order to deliver different outcomes. And so the task, I think, for all of us really is to, if we're going to address these key challenges of inequality, climate breakdown, etc., we need to start turning our attention to the goals that actually matter. So the things that we really need to do, things like transitioning to an environmentally sustainable economy, eradicating poverty, reducing inequality, improving health, etc. Really think about what is it that as a society we really need to achieve, and use every tool available to our disposal in order to rewrite the rules of the economy to serve those ends. So at the moment, the ends that we're serving is higher inequality, environmental catastrophe, all those things. So what do we need to do to rewire the economy in order to serve a different set of ends is the conversation that I think we need to be having. So what does that mean? I'm just going to go through a couple of areas here. As I say, I can't go through everything here, but just to kind of stimulate some discussion, I think there's some key areas that are critical to this and that are absolutely core to any form of managing the economy differently. So the first one here I just want to talk about is ownership. Who owns and controls the economy and different parts of it, and the wealth in the economy is absolutely fundamental to how the economy functions, and crucially, and whose interest is it serving. And what we've had as a consequence of the sort of neoliberal model that we've seen imposed on us on the past 4 decades is the rise of a very extractive, short-termist corporate model focused very much on short-term profits. And there's evidence that that's linked to all kinds of social problems and indeed environmental problems. And so we need to be replacing that with a new democratic vision of ownership that crucially gives a wider group of stakeholders a stake and a say in the decisions that affect them. So at the moment, it's kind of the shareholders of companies are really have a dictatorship almost on what corporations do, whereas really other stakeholders like the workers of that company or the customers of that company or the environment or a whole bunch of other stakeholders should really be having a stake and a say over how enterprises are operating. And there are a number of different models here. This isn't a sort of black and white. In the past, there's been this very black and white binary view of you either have the state in a kind of top-down state socialist way, or you have, pure profit maximizing private enterprise. And there are a whole range of different ownership models, from cooperative ownership, municipal ownership, community ownership, that all actually might be better in different circumstances in terms of how you run different areas of the economy. And crucially, this doesn't just apply to enterprise, it's also areas like data. How we own and control and govern data is one of the key questions of the 21st century. At the moment, it's just left as a free-for-all to people like Google and Apple operating according to that corporate model. It also applies to things like land and housing. A lot of the housing crisis that we see can be, in this country in particular, as a consequence of that approach of privatization, of leaving things to the market in the hope that it will solve it. And actually what it's done is make things much worse. So how can we do housing and land ownership differently? And obviously in Scotland, we've got quite an interesting record of land reform and community ownership and things. There's a lot to learn from there in terms of where we go from there. And also natural resources as well. So how we own and steward the natural environment is one of the key questions of the 21st century as well. Again, in Scotland, lots of our resources are owned either by private enterprise, or they're owned by individuals, for example? Are there better ownership models that are going to deliver better social environmental outcomes? Living within planetary boundaries. So, I mean, this is, again, one of the key things that, you know, how do we rein in our economic activity into a way which is actually compatible with our ecological limits? And this is obviously one of the key questions that we face. And I think broadly, again, this is very succinct, but broadly, we absolutely need to be repurposing the economy away from, at the firm level, the focus on profit maximization, but at the aggregate level of the economy, GDP, gross domestic product, economic growth, as the sort of the barometer by which we measure the success of the economy, be moving away from that towards focusing on measures that reflect human and ecological well-being. And in practice, what does that mean? Well, first thing is, again, going back to this idea of markets, well, you know, we shouldn't be afraid to be eliminating or abolishing markets, areas of the economy that are either immoral, harmful, or don't serve any clear public purpose. You know, we didn't abolish slavery or child labor for it because of any kind of economic law. We did it because it was just immoral, and it's clearly it was immoral. And today we need to be not afraid to say the same thing about the fossil fuel industry, or about, you know, dangerous financial instruments that financial institutions are using, which are causing, potentially could cause another financial crisis, or exploitative labor practice. The whole parts of the economy that just really need to be shut down, and shut down quite quickly. We also need to be talking about introducing hard limits, caps, if you like, on resource use, different types of resource use. Again, to absolutely, this idea that we can just keep plundering the planet in an unlimited fashion clearly is disastrous. And so having hard limits on the amount of resources that we can use, different types of resources, that we can't exceed that, I think is absolutely key. And again, using things like tax and regulation to bring particularly advanced countries like the UK, who are living well beyond our sort of fair share of our planet's capacity, but also who historically have used up much more than our fair share as well, because we industrialized much earlier. And moving towards, sometimes referred to, a circular model of economy, but basically what that means is, at the moment, we all buy stuff, we all own stuff that's designed to fail within 5 years or so, and then we throw it away and we buy another stuff. So moving away from that to promoting maintenance, repair, reuse, recycling, and moving towards a rental model across the board, where we don't all need to own stuff that sits in our cupboard and hardly ever gets used. And again, there's lots of interesting work on this, including in Scotland, which is promising. Another thing just to mention here is around working time, something that's risen up the political agenda in recent years, in some places, but the fight to get a weekend was a struggle that was fought by the labour movement and was won. And now in the 21st century, should we be talking about reducing the working time further, not just from a social standpoint, but also from an ecological one? There's quite a lot of evidence that shorter working week actually has environmental benefits as well. And transforming finance, which is just one of the second last thing I'm just going to say. Obviously, at the moment, we have, particularly in the UK, a situation where the financial system is very much part of the problem. It's channeling billions into harmful speculation in the financial sector and the housing market, and into things like fossil fuel extraction. And so we need to move from a situation where the financial system, which is key to how our economy works, is part of the problem, to where it's part of the solution. And part of that is around scaling down the more harmful parts of the financial sector, and crucially, though, scaling up new more purpose-oriented financial institutions that prioritize social and environmental objectives rather than just short-term profit. So things like public investment banks. Scotland just established one, just launched last week, actually. The jury's still out on whether it's going to do enough, but that's still a good sign. Other forms of, for example, banks, high street banks that are more either cooperatively owned or publicly owned, and again are putting customers before the bottom line. And crucially, the last thing on finance is just this, back to this question around ownership. What we've seen under the neoliberal approach of the past 4 decades is large parts of the economy that were previously publicly owned kind of sold off and particularly in things like utilities, the way that this was sold was that everyone could be a shareholder, and the state shouldn't own it. And if everyone has a shareholder, everyone it'll be kind of democratic. And what's happened is ownership's just been hoovered up by an increasingly small elite. And so if we're talking about reforming the financial sector, some people have put forward the idea of a kind of a social wealth fund, which is effectively a large scale wealth fund that owns parts of the economy that we all have a stake in and we all reap some of the financial rewards from. So in a similar way as places like Norway have that with oil, and specifically with oil, doing this in a sort of 21st century, which isn't just focused on oil, but it's focused on having a public wealth fund in different parts of the economy that generates returns, which we all share in, we all benefit from. And the very final thing I'm just going to talk about, I realize this has been quite a lot to take in, is just around the role of the state and this term called decommodification. There are some parts of the economy that I think it's very clear now, which were kind of put into the market and subject to market mechanisms and competition, which it just doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense for them to be subjected to that, and actually has some pretty harmful consequences. And as I say there, what's profitable is not always useful, and what's useful is not always profitable. And so the question of, well, what is the role for the state in the 21st century in the provision of services as opposed to the market in some form? And that, for me, a useful exercise is kind of, we had these massive reforms in the 20th century of the National Health Service and public libraries, another huge social reform, which really brought a whole swathe of the economy into collective provision out of the market, and which people have benefited hugely from. And what's the kind of equivalence of that in the 21st century that we should be talking about? And some of you might have heard about things like universal basic income, also universal basic services, which is the idea that there should be a basic set of services that everyone can have access to for free, the basic kind of rights that everyone has, which of course includes things like healthcare, but might also include things like broadband in the 21st century, for example. And the principle, I think, which is a good one, this actually is from George Monbiot, the journalist, of private sufficiency, public luxury. And that's the idea that really in the 21st century, we don't have enough ecological space for everyone to have private luxury. Not everyone can have huge swimming pools and 5 cars and all the rest of it, because we just don't have the environmental space. But we all, if we are smart about it, can actually have shared public luxury. So things like high quality, accessible, free at the point of use public transport, parks, open spaces, leisure centres, swimming pools. We can actually be doing that. And so this idea of moving towards private sufficiency and public luxury, I think, is an important one, particularly with the environmental challenges that we face. And crucially, all of this is really designed to sort of foster an economic system that provides a minimum standard of living that nobody can fall below. Unlike at the moment, where the sort of winner takes all mentality means that you have people at the very, very top doing very well, and you have people falling through the many holes in our welfare system that are really on the breadline. And so the very final thing I just want to say, which I'm kind of finished with the slides, is just, I realize that's been a big sort of jaunt through lots of things, and there's probably lots of things went through too quickly. That was very much focused on the what, which is what should we do, and that's kind of the easy bit. The hard bit is very much the how. How do we get from where we are to where we want to go to? And that's why activism, campaigning, organizations, all the rest of it is so important, because without doing the actual hard work of campaigning and on these issues and shifting the agenda, then just having good ideas about what we need to do is kind of it's not really relevant. It's only if we actually get moving on the ground that we can make progress here. So yeah, I'll stop there. Thanks very much.